People's Platform.
Good evening and welcome to the People's Platform. Holding a free, fair and transparent election in Sri Lanka. What exactly does this mean? What exactly does this entail? Let's have the conversation. I'm so pleased to welcome to the studio Pasan Jayasinghe, doctoral candidate in political science. Good evening and welcome back, Pasan. Hi. Pasan, Sri Lanka is anticipating its presidential election, general election, and the political stage is very much heating up. Speak to us about what factors Sri Lanka should consider in ensuring a free, fair and transparent election with special emphasis on the campaign finance side of things.
Sure. So as you know, after many of the very huge economic, social upheavals that have happened in our country for the last 2 to 3 years, right? I think the context in which these elections will take place, especially the presidential one, which is intended to happen first, it comes in, I think, in a time of quite a lot of still ongoing crisis, right? And I think it makes it quite different to when the previous presidential election was held in 2019. And there's been, even besides the crisis, there's been a number of legislative changes that might affect this election. So that includes some campaign finance provisions that have been passed. The provisions that might apply to upcoming elections will be mainly centered around asset declarations and for political parties and candidates especially to provide itemized lists and resources of the finances that they have been committing in order to run their campaigns, right? So now campaign finance laws have been a demand of civil society activists, of many academics in Sri Lanka for a very long time, because if even in the context of South Asia, Sri Lanka has the weakest campaign finance laws. So even in places like India and Pakistan, there are much stronger campaign finance laws which ensure that there is some transparency in what kinds of expenditures that political parties and political candidates make, right? And that the public, especially the voting public, has awareness of that, right? Now in Sri Lanka, because there is until the recently passed laws, that was in last year, there basically was no campaign finance legal infrastructure, right? Which meant that no one kind of had an idea of how much money was being spent. We knew that a lot of money was being spent, and some organizations, especially election monitoring organizations, would try and monitor some of those expenditures by, for example, contacting news media organizations and saying how much money was spent on advertisements, right? But without that information coming from the political parties themselves or the candidates, you can't get a full picture of it, right? So there would be always sort of estimates of what was being spent, and as a result, we knew that we see our daily during a political campaign, right? You see our TV news screens, newspapers, posters on walls, right? We are being inundated with so much advertising material, campaign promotions material, but there's no idea of how much is being spent, and it really also creates this very unequal playing field, right? Because if there are no restrictions about how much can be spent, which many countries which do have campaign finance laws do say, if you're a candidate of this for this particular office, you can sort of spend only a maximum of this amount, right? When you don't have that sort of restriction, there's no ceiling, right? So you can spend as much as you want, and which really favors very wealthy candidates with a lot of resources, right? And also candidates who can get money from places that citizens might be concerned about the ethics of, right? For example, external sources from foreign countries or foreign organizations. And in Sri Lanka, it's sort of a very Wild West, right? That you don't know what's happening. People have suspicions, right? But then those suspicions also really, if you don't have sort of proper data or proper information about it, then that suspicion also sort of clouds the political discourse, right? Because everyone's sort of slinging mud at each other about what's being spent, whose money is being spent, right? And there's so much sort of colloquial knowledge or discourse in Sri Lanka about like these candidates are in the pockets of such and such businesses or such and such criminal gangs or whatever, right? But again, without that sort of monitoring of it, or then the provision of data and restrictions on how much can be spent, then we don't quite know, right? And so the laws that were passed last year, they provide some of those restrictions and some of those provisions that enable some sort of stronger reporting to happen. It's not everything that activists have been asking for, and this will also be the first elections that those provisions will be tested, right?
Sure.
And so there'll be sort of a learning curve on that. The main thing that needs to happen is for the Election Commission to be able to apply the law effectively, right? Which means non-interference in the Commission's work from political parties, from political candidates, and it's unfortunate that even within the last couple of years that hasn't been a guarantee, right? Because we saw how at the start of last year the Commission, which was trying to proceed with the local government body elections, right, that was prevented from doing that. So there's again no guarantee that the Commission's work will not be unhindered, but it needs to be allowed to do its job so that that basic campaign finance legislative infrastructure can take hold, right?
Some of the most common election tactics that have been used by successive politicians over the years and over the decades have been fear-mongering, thuggery, bribery, racism. And I mean, this has been ongoing. It's not just an issue that we've been seeing these days.
Yeah.
I mean, 70 years ago,
yes,
this would have been there. And it's still a current topic of discussion.
Yeah.
From a research point of view, how do you think these tactics still continue to sustain themselves? So, I mean,
Sanali, you're very right that basically for the entirety of Sri Lanka's independent history and even before that, the sort of tactics of sort of voter intimidation, but particularly intimidation that's informed by very strong bases in discrimination, right? And particularly along the lines of ethnicity. That has been a very strong part of Sri Lankan political discourse, the Sri Lankan political structure for so long, right? Now, I think from a very analytical point of view about just how these things come about to be, it is an unfortunate fact of Sri Lanka's demographics in a way, because it encourages, it's the start of Sri Lanka's democratic election history really encouraged the development of a very strong two-party system, right? And that was also due to the electoral system, but the Sri Lanka Freedom Party and the United National Party, UNP, SLFP, that was the equation for such a long time in Sri Lanka's history, and those two parties, whenever they've been in power or in opposition, they've been compelled to campaign along sort of very majoritarian policies and appealing very much to the Sinhala electorate, right? And because Sri Lanka's ethnic majority, right, of the majority of the population happens to be that, then over time those electoral appeals became stronger and stronger, and those parties were very much compelled to keep making those appeals, right? And so in a way those things, that sort of very ethnicity-based campaigning and very much sort of positing ethnic minorities, but particularly the Tamil minority for basically the first couple of decades of our history, up to all throughout the ethnic conflict, right, which it really precipitated a civil war in Sri Lanka, and then even more recently against the Muslim minority. The political parties, especially majoritarian political parties, are compelled to make those appeals, right? Because it's what gets them votes, and because of the fact that the majority of the electorate is a particular ethnicity, right? There's when basically all the main political parties make those appeals, right, it kind of embeds that into this structure. Now, I think there's different kind of contours to that over time we see, and particularly with the fact that apart from the major parties, that minor parties, particularly along ethnic lines, are formed, right? Especially in the north and east, with regards to Tamil political parties, but also Muslim political parties and so on. But that was in some ways also a reaction to that majoritarianism of the major single political parties, right? And so that those politics have kind of been playing along for most of our history. I think the events of the last couple of years present maybe disruptors to that, and we saw particularly, for example, during the height of the economic crisis, that a lot of people, there was some sort of understanding, at least among the single electorate, if not a wholesale understanding, maybe at least a idea that we've been tricked for this time, right? And particularly by the Rajapakshas, who might represent that sort of very strong Sinhala nationalist politics, right? That was kind of used to sort of basically trick Sinhala voters into that sort of politics, and that has resulted in sort of economic ruin for them, right? And so I think the events of the last couple of years, and particularly some of the politics around the Aragalaya, might suggest avenues or pathways where some of those discourses might be disrupted, but we don't know for sure. And I think the way that particularly this government, right, has in a lot of ways tried to very strongly repudiate what has happened through the Aragalaya, right, both in using the security state, right, to repress some of those currents, right, but also to in lots of ways to pretend as if it didn't happen, right?
Sure.
That means that that it's still unclear if there's been a very strong disruption to that sort of majoritarian politics, and if there's, and I don't know if there's a guarantee that that won't arise again with a new election.
So, Pasan, one of the deeply problematic issues with this concept of hypernationalism and majoritarianism is that we don't get to hear diverse voices being heard or represented, as a result of which decision making becomes very narrow-minded and skewed.
I think that's also a very much a symptom of Sri Lanka's democratic culture, right? And by that I mean, when you look at who the big players in our democratic system are, they are the political parties, right? And that they are supposed to sort of cater to voters. They're supposed to represent particular segments of voters and their interests, right? And in that way, and then election campaigns are supposed to be debates between various issues that face the country, that face voters, and so on, right? But when you look at political parties, especially as these strong actors within the democratic structure, we know that Sri Lankan political parties are extremely undemocratic, right? Where if you compare to basically even political parties across South Asia, definitely across Asia and much of the Western world, our political parties are very much just fiefdoms, right? They are just run by one particular individual. If you look at many of the major political parties' constitutions, they are sort of generally geared towards one person, the leader, retaining all essentially the entirety of power.
So you're
within
talking
the party.
about a lack of intra-party democracy.
Yeah, definitely, and even in sort of basic democratic systems across Asia, right? You would find that in some countries, at least there's a provision that the leader of the party should be nominated and voted for by the MPs of that party, right? And in a lot of the political parties, the major political parties in Sri Lanka now, that's not even a basic consideration, right? In other countries, the sort of that level of intra-party democracy goes all the way to all the members of a party being able to vote for who the leader of that party should be, right? Which is a laughable concept in Sri Lanka, right? And that is how these sort of very strong political dynasties, right, have kept their grip on Sri Lankan politics by being in controlling parties in that way, right? And the reason why that's kind of important to this is that level of undemocraticness that you find within political parties, it seeps down into the rest of the discourse, right? So all of our basic political discourse is really about these personalities from very elite privileged backgrounds and elite privileged family histories, right? Being in power for so much of our history, right? So that's why we even now our political discourse is just dominated by the Bandar Nayakas or the Sena Nayakas or the Vikramasinghes, right? And that's a thing that hasn't changed for the last 75 years, and that really comes down to that level of that lack of one of those factors is that lack of intra-party democracy.
All right, we're going for a short commercial break. We'll be right back.
The People's Platform. TV1. TV for life.
Iran's president to visit Sri Lanka tomorrow. 5 agreements to be inked alongside the opening of Uma Oya. Chinese Communist Party delegation meets NPP in Colombo. Indian spiritual delegation following the Ramayan trail visit Hanuman Kovil in Ramboda. Sajid responds to NPP, calls for debates between leaders and economic councils in May. Sirasa Namami heads to the islet of Nagadeepa to mark Bak Poya. Sri Lanka's star batter Chamaryatapattu becomes top-ranked batter in ICC Women's ODI rankings.
TV1. TV for life. The People's Platform.
Welcome back. Towards citizen-centred elections is the topic of discussion tonight. My guest is Pasan Jayasinghe, doctoral candidate in political science. Pasan, when we talk about elections in Sri Lanka, we must mention how income inequalities and economic disparities are oftentimes weaponized against individuals. So when we hear of elections, we also hear of the Araku Kalai Bat Packet Tekai culture, or give me your vote and I'll give jobs for your children, or a plot of land or other benefits. So this completely takes away the autonomy and the dignity of the vote and the whole election process and democracy and all of these principles that we theoretically have to uphold.
I think I have maybe a slightly alternative view on this.
Sure.
Partly, I think we have to kind of take into stock the fact that, this is a country, like, why do those appeals have such resonance, right? Why is a vote in exchange for a meal, right? Or a job, why does that have resonance, right? And it's because most people in our country are in places of extreme sort of material deprivation,
Absolutely.
right? And that has gotten even worse over the last couple of years, right? And in that sense, I think the exchange of that for a vote is not necessarily a very deep question for a lot of people, because you would be asking, for a lot of people, they would be like, we vote for a candidate, we vote for a government in, with whatever hopes and high expectations that you might have, and nothing ends up happening, right? So why not exchange a vote for something that's a clear material benefit, right?
Sure.
And so I think in order to sort of address this, we can't really just focus on preaching to voters about the sanctity of the vote and how you should be more informed. Of course, people should be more informed, but I think we should also have a more holistic view about the kind of society and kind of context these elections take place, right?
Sure.
And that in order to have that sort of expansive level of democracy, we need to consider the fact that we also need to make the material living conditions of people better, right?
Yes.
And it's only until then, when those conditions are realized, that that sanctity of the vote has different meaning, right? Where if people aren't tempted by a meal or a job, in exchange for a vote, it would be good to get to a society where that temptation doesn't exist, right? And so I think instead of kind of blaming voters, right, for exchanging their votes in that way, right, we should be thinking more about the structure and also the political parties and candidates that are compelling this, right?
Sure.
It's such a cynical way to conduct elections. It's such a cynical way to frame our whole democracy. So, yeah.
Sure. So in what ways do you think the government can promote economic inclusivity and promote social cohesion through its electoral policies and initiatives?
I think it's difficult to sort of promote that in that way just through electoral policies, right? But there is ways that there are definitely ways that the government can increase democratic participation or increase the democratic value of the policies that it makes, right? And that is by providing avenues for consultation, right? By providing avenues for citizens themselves to provide their views, to express their objections about a lot of the policies that the government is undertaking, right? And something that we've seen over the last 2.5 years, and especially since the Wickremesinghe government has been initiated, is that there has been a raft of really expansive major reforms in so many areas of Sri Lankan society, especially relating to material welfare and economic conditions, right? And those laws have been basically rammed through Parliament, right, with very minimal oversight, and without providing avenues for interested stakeholders, right, including organizations and people who work at the sort of grassroots levels, right. We saw that, for example, the way that the Aswasama program was introduced to replace the Samudri program, right? The parameters of it, no one kind of knew how it was going to be implemented beforehand, right? There was no sort of citizen consultation about who should be involved, and so what was happening was that all of these policies are being created by a very elite set of people, the advisors to the president or the ministries, a number of very well funded think tanks, right? Who and many of which in Sri Lanka adhere to very particular economic ideologies, right? And there's very little space for citizen groups, for civil society organizations, for trade unions outside of those structures of privilege to kind of have any input, right? And we should consider that sort of input as a democratic way of increasing the democratic participation in policy making, right? And so I think that might be one way of sort of increasing democracy in the sort of economic structures that the government is building, restructuring, reforming continuously, right? And yeah, we need to have that sort of input instead of just waiting for our time to work.
Pasan, all these sound fabulous. Yeah. Who is going to have the political will to make this work?
Yeah. So again, there's definitely a vested interest on the part of the government, right, to get its reform agenda or its policy agenda through, right? And so in that sense, and if you look at it from an ideological sense about the kinds of economic policies they're pursuing, about the kinds of wider policies they're pursuing, right? Then there doesn't seem to be, from the outside, there doesn't seem to be much of a will for them to change course, right? To make themselves more democratic or more accountable in any way. And I think that leaves it up to citizens from the outside to make at least some sort of trying to raise their voices, and trying to at least be informed about what's happening, right? And the government is not completely unresponsive to that, right? Because we have seen a number of areas in the past 2 or 3 years where it has backed down on certain things, right? For example, there was the proposal to lower the age of consent, right? Through amendments to the penal code, and there was a massive public outcry, right? And that resulted in that policy being withdrawn, right? And that was also a policy that had not had any public consultation. Even the ministry was unaware how it had happened, right? According to them, right? And so if people sort of care enough about sort of raising some of that, some of their voices, right, about saying, hey, like the idea of democracy for us is not just a vote, that these policies that affect us, we should also be able to have a say in it, right? And there are not a huge number of avenues for that in Sri Lanka, but there are a few at least, right? And we know that given enough pressure, the government will back down on certain things. So, yeah.
Sure. And finally, Pasan, when we talk about holding elections, the government has to balance competing interests almost, maintaining sovereignty, independence in electoral processes, in the face of external pressures, foreign investment, economic development. So it's a lot.
It's a lot, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think especially over the last 2 years, as the government is going through ahead with the IMF program, right, which is also another external entity that is directing the policy directions of the government, right? It's it is the job of the government to balance all of these things, right? And I think it's the job of opposition parties, of civil society, of trade unions, and of citizens themselves to have an opinion, to express, and to have some sort of account of how is that balancing being done, right? Who is it being done in favor of, right? And so one of the criticisms, especially with the IMF program, has been that, again, like the other policy that we were kind of talking about before, that there's been such little sort of democratic participation in how it's been designed and how it's been implemented, that for a lot of ordinary people, it feels like something that's just been imposed, right, on them. And we saw this come up, especially at the start of the year when the VAT increases came in, right? And last year as well when the ETF restructure was happening. And so the government will do whatever balancing job it thinks it has to do, right? I think it's up to us to make some sort of value judgment about if that balancing job is correct or not, right? And I would personally hope that Sri Lankans are able to express their opinion about that value judgment, right? In more ways than just waiting for the vote, right? Because I think that mentality also of waiting for the vote every 5 years, right, is also how a lot of what's been done to Sri Lanka, to Sri Lankans, right, how that's been allowed to happen. Yeah.
All right. Pasan Jayasinghe, thank you very much for sharing your perspectives. Thank you for watching us. We'll see you again tomorrow. Good night.